Miss Elena Thompson was a teacher who wore bright dresses and always smiled at her students. She had big dreams and loved to try new things in her classroom. One day, she had an idea that she believed would change her life forever. She wanted to take her students on a very special school trip, one that would happen in a faraway place, full of exciting adventures. She walked into the school board meeting with a colorful folder in her hands. Her heart beat faster than usual. She looked around the room at the board members, who were all older and very serious. Miss Thompson smiled brightly and held up her folder. "Hello, everyone," she said, her voice warm and sweet. "I have the most wonderful plan. I want to take my students to a remote location, far away from busy roads and noisy streets. It will be the ultimate educational experience. They can learn about nature, teamwork, and so much more." The board members blinked, surprised by her idea. One of them, Mr. Brown, cleared his throat. "Miss Thompson, that sounds very interesting," he said slowly, "but can you tell us more about your qualifications? Are you sure you can keep the students safe?" Miss Thompson waved her hand, like she was brushing away a tiny fly. "Of course, Mr. Brown," she said. "I have taken many nature workshops. I've read countless books on outdoor education. The children will be safe with me, I promise." In truth, Miss Thompson had only gone on a few simple hikes. She had watched some online videos about camping, but she had never actually led a trip like this before. Still, she was convinced that this was her chance to win the Innovative Teaching award she had always dreamed about. She believed that if she could pull off such a bold trip, people would see her as a brilliant educator. Mrs. Green, another board member, raised an eyebrow. "This trip sounds very expensive," she said. "We have a tight budget for school activities this year. How will we pay for it?" Miss Thompson stood up straighter. She reached into her folder and pulled out papers that listed costs and sponsor names. She had contacted a few local businesses, promising them they could use photos from the trip to show how they supported education. She had also cut a few corners to reduce the overall price. For example, she had picked an inexperienced bus driver who charged less money, and she had chosen older camping equipment because it was cheaper. "I have everything covered," she told them confidently, tapping her folder. "We have sponsors who will help, and we can do a small fundraiser. This trip will be an amazing opportunity for the students. They will see the world in a whole new way." The board members looked at her papers. They were worried about the cost and the risk, but Miss Thompson's excitement was contagious. She painted a beautiful picture of children exploring nature, learning survival skills, and growing up strong and brave. She even brought up how proud the school would look if photos of the trip appeared in newspapers or on social media. Mr. Brown and Mrs. Green exchanged glances. Then they looked at Miss Thompson's bright eyes and enthusiastic smile. They sighed. Although they felt unsure, they decided to trust her. "All right," Mr. Brown said at last, "we will approve your trip on one condition. You must make sure the parents are fully informed, and you must have all the proper safety measures in place." Miss Thompson gave them a big smile. "Yes, of course, Mr. Brown," she replied. "You won't regret this. I will make sure everything is perfect." Outside the meeting room, Miss Thompson clutched her folder tightly against her chest and grinned from ear to ear. Her head was buzzing with thoughts about how she would organize the trip, how the children would love the wild outdoors, and especially how she might finally win the Innovative Teaching award. She pictured herself standing on a stage, holding a shiny trophy while everyone clapped. She imagined people saying, "Miss Thompson is the bravest and most creative teacher. Look at the wonderful trip she planned." The idea made her feel warm and happy inside. But beneath her bright smile, she knew she had not told the school board everything. She had not mentioned how she hurried through the paperwork for the bus driver, nor had she mentioned that the camping gear was secondhand and possibly outdated. She also didn't talk about her real reason for doing this trip, to gain fame and recognition. As she walked down the hallway, she met a fellow teacher named Mr. Lewis. He was a kind older man who had taught for many years. He looked at the folder in her hands. "So, Elena," he said gently, "you got the trip approved, didn't you?" "Yes, I did." Miss Thompson answered, bouncing on her toes. Isn't it wonderful? Mr. Lewis nodded slowly, but there was worry in his eyes. I hope you know what you're doing, he said. Remote locations can be dangerous if you're not fully prepared. Don't worry, Miss Thompson replied, waving away his concerns just as she had done in the board meeting. It will be fine. The children need a big adventure. They will learn so much from it. Mr. Lewis gave her a small smile. He did not want to ruin her excitement, but his gut told him that this trip might be too much. Still, Miss Thompson seemed so sure of herself that he just nodded and said, Good luck, Elena. Miss Thompson rushed to her classroom where her students waited. She greeted them with a cheerful, Hello, everyone. I have a special surprise for you. How would you all like to go on the most exciting trip ever? The children looked at one another. Some of them were curious. Others were a little scared. But Miss Thompson's voice sparkled with enthusiasm as she painted a picture of tall trees, fresh air, and open skies. We will camp under the stars, she told them, making grand gestures with her arms. We'll see waterfalls and animals. We will learn about nature by living in it, not just by reading books. The classroom filled with gasps and cheers, as most of the kids were excited by this new idea. A boy named Daniel asked, Will there be marshmallows, Miss Thompson? Yes, Daniel, she laughed. We will roast marshmallows by the campfire every night. A shy girl named Lisa raised her hand and said, I've never been camping before. Is it safe? Miss Thompson smiled gently. Of course, Lisa, she replied. I will be there to make sure everyone is safe. You'll see how fun it is. Inside, Miss Thompson felt a small twinge of worry. She knew she still had a lot to plan. But she brushed that thought aside. After all, she believed that with enough determination, everything would fall into place. As the day ended, Miss Thompson packed up her things and headed home, thinking about the trip nonstop. She made a list of tasks, send permission slips to parents, order more supplies, double-check the bus details. Yet in her heart, the biggest item on her list was winning that special award. She wanted people to see her as a teacher who changed lives in a bold, unforgettable way. She turned out the lights in her classroom, locking the door behind her, and whispered to herself, This will be the best trip ever. They'll all see. I'll show them how great I am. Little did she know, her grand ambition would soon spiral into a terrifying experience that would change her and her students forever. After the school board's approval, Miss Thompson threw herself into planning. She filled binders with checklists and schedules. She met with sponsors who provided extra funds for the trip. Everything looked fine on the surface, yet small troubles began to pop up. One morning, the principal, Mr. Adams, poked his head into Miss Thompson's classroom. Elena, he said in a soft voice, I've been talking to some parents. They're worried about how remote this campsite is. They also said they want more details about the safety plan. Miss Thompson smiled confidently, even though her heart skipped a beat. Please tell them there is nothing to worry about, she replied. I'll write up a clear plan and send it out soon. I'm working on the final details now. Mr. Adams nodded but looked concerned. All right, he said. Make sure you do. We want the parents to feel comfortable. Miss Thompson waved goodbye as he left, telling herself that parents worried too much. She believed that if she showed them a cheerful face and promised fun, they would calm down. She wrote a short letter explaining that the campsite was safe enough and that the students would be supervised at all times. Another day, Miss Thompson was checking the bus arrangements. She found a driver named Mr. Collier who was very cheap. He was friendly but young, and he admitted he had never driven on mountain roads before. He said, I usually drive the local routes, ma'am. But I think I can manage. I just need a good map. Miss Thompson nodded, ignoring the uneasy feeling in her stomach. Yes, that's fine, she answered. She liked that his service cost less, because that meant she could use the extra money for other parts of the trip. She thought, we'll be okay. He'll figure it out. Soon after, Mr. Lewis came to speak with her. He had seen the list of activities Miss Thompson planned: camping, hiking, rock climbing, and kayaking. The list made him nervous. "Elena," he said kindly, "some of these activities seem a bit advanced. Have you done them before?" Miss Thompson brushed off his question with a smile. "I've read a lot about them, and we will have guides," she said. "Don't worry." Mr. Lewis shook his head. "Sometimes reading about something isn't the same as doing it," he replied. "And I think the gear you're getting might be too old. Are you sure it's all safe?" "They passed inspection a while ago," Miss Thompson mumbled, flipping through her papers. "We got a good discount on them." It's fine. These things always work out." She labeled Mr. Lewis a fearmonger behind his back, thinking he just didn't appreciate her vision. She told herself that all big adventures come with risks. Besides, if she played it too safe, it wouldn't be exciting enough for the award judges to notice. Even as small warning signs piled up, Miss Thompson refused to slow down. She told anyone who showed concern, the bigger the risk, the bigger the reward. To her, any cautious advice was just negative thinking that might ruin her chance to be truly amazing. Parents kept asking about medical supplies, emergency plans, and staff training. Miss Thompson smiled and repeated that everything was under control. She assured them that all students would have a wonderful time. In her mind, if problems came up, she would handle them in the moment. After all, she believed she was a strong, resourceful teacher. Some of her colleagues quietly talked among themselves in the teacher's lounge. They said things like, "Have you seen the old tents she's taking?" Or, "I heard the campsite might have storms at this time of year." But Miss Thompson refused to listen. She focused on positive thoughts, ignoring any negativity. Finally, the day arrived when all the preparation was done. Miss Thompson had a printed schedule that looked neat and organized. She had 2 vans full of food, gear, and excited children. She told herself that she was ready. Before they left, Miss Thompson gathered her class in the school gym. She said, "Students, this is going to be the greatest adventure of our lives. We will learn so many lessons about nature and about ourselves. We will come back stronger and smarter." The children cheered. Some of them were nervous, but Miss Thompson's enthusiasm was like a bright light shining in the dark. She convinced them that everything would be fantastic. Parents gave their kids hugs and reminders like, "Listen to Miss Thompson," or "Stay close to your friends." Miss Thompson nodded politely to the parents, though she felt a bit impatient. She wanted to get on the road quickly. She remembered to say, "Don't worry, parents. I have a plan for every situation." Deep down, she hadn't really double-checked everything, but she felt sure she could handle whatever happened. Meanwhile, Mr. Lewis watched the scene from a distance. He was not going on the trip, but he felt a heavy knot in his stomach. Something about Miss Thompson's attitude concerned him. He noticed that the brand name on the tents was extremely old. He also saw that the new bus driver looked nervous, flipping through some maps. Still, Miss Thompson was already waving the children onto the bus, telling them to pick their seats. She clapped her hands and said, "Adventure awaits." She believed wholeheartedly that once they reached the campsite, everything would fall into place and all her worries would disappear. And so, in the face of every warning sign, lack of experience, old equipment, anxious colleagues, Miss Thompson pressed forward. She smiled and repeated her mantra, "Bigger risk, bigger reward." Little did she know, those ignored warnings would soon turn her grand dream into a nightmare none of them would ever forget. The morning sun was gentle as the students piled onto the bus. Each child held a small backpack with snacks, water, and a favorite toy or book. Their excited chatter filled the air. Miss Thompson stood at the front of the bus, telling them to buckle up. "Everyone ready?" she called out with a grin. The children nodded eagerly, and the bus rumbled to life. Mr. Collier, the young driver, glanced in the rearview mirror and tried to smile confidently. He had never driven so many kids before, let alone on roads that led far into the mountains. The journey started off fine. They passed fields and small towns. The kids laughed, played games, and shared sweets. Miss Thompson walked up and down the aisle, reminding them to drink water and look out the windows at the scenery. She thought, "This is perfect. Soon we'll be camping under the stars." But after a few hours, the roads began to change. They grew narrower and windier, twisting around tall, rocky hills. Mr. Collier noticed that the bus's engine was working hard to climb. He checked the gauges on the dashboard, feeling slightly uneasy. Miss Thompson peered ahead. She saw that the road led into a remote area with very few signposts. Still, she told Mr. Collier, "Keep going. We're on the right track, I'm sure of it." Suddenly, there was a loud pop. The bus swerved, causing the kids to scream and hold onto their seats. Mr. Collier fought the steering wheel, trying to bring the bus under control. Finally, he managed to pull over to the side of the road. "What was that?" a boy named Timmy cried out, his eyes wide with fear. A girl named Sarah clutched her friend's hand, tears forming in her eyes. "I think we have a flat tire," Mr. Collier announced, hopping out to inspect. Dust swirled around him as he kneeled to take a look. Sure enough, one of the front tires was torn. The rubber had completely ripped, probably from a sharp rock on the bumpy road. Miss Thompson stepped off the bus too, her face tight. "Can you fix it quickly?" she asked, tapping her foot. She worried about being delayed, but she tried to remain calm for the kids. Mr. Collier nodded, wiping sweat from his forehead. "I have a spare tire. But this is tricky on such an uneven shoulder. And I'm not used to changing tires on a big bus." He began the slow process of jacking up the vehicle and wrestling with the heavy tire. Miss Thompson watched the sky, worried that they were losing time. She didn't like the idea of arriving at the campsite late. Her schedule had them setting up tents before dark, and she didn't want to ruin that plan. After a long while, Mr. Collier replaced the tire. He looked exhausted and concerned. "This could be dangerous," he said quietly to Miss Thompson. "The road is rough and we still have a way to go. Maybe we should turn back and find a safer route." Miss Thompson pressed her lips together. She could see the kids were restless and a bit scared. But she thought about her big dream, about the sponsors, and about the award she so badly wanted. "No," she said firmly. "It's just a little excitement for the kids. We'll keep going. We can't give up now." Mr. Collier hesitated, but Miss Thompson's tone left no room for debate. So he climbed back into the driver's seat and started the bus again. The children let out shaky sighs, hoping the worst was over. As the bus continued, the landscape became more rugged. They saw steep cliffs and deep valleys. Some kids gasped at the view. Miss Thompson reminded them to hold onto their seats when the bus jolted over bumps and stones. She reassured them, "We'll reach our campsite soon, and you'll love it." But inside, she felt a rising fear she tried to ignore. The road had almost no other vehicles. There were hardly any houses or stores. If something else went wrong, help might be very far away. Yet the thought of turning back made her feel like a failure, so she pushed onward. To distract the children, Miss Thompson asked them to sing songs. Their voices lifted, filling the bus with cheerful melodies. For a moment, the tension eased. Yet every once in a while, the bus would lurch, and the kids would stop singing to grip their seats. At last, the road turned into a dirt path, and Mr. Collier announced, "This must be the final stretch to the campsite." Trees towered on either side, forming a tunnel of green leaves. Some children pressed their faces to the windows, fascinated by the huge old trees. A few minutes later, the bus came to a clearing with a small sign that read, "Campsite." Miss Thompson beamed. "We're here," she declared. The children erupted in relieved claps and cheers. Despite the scare with the tire, they had made it. They piled off the bus, stretching their legs. The air felt cool and smelled like pine. There was soft dirt under their feet, and they could see a wide river in the distance. Some kids were thrilled to be out in nature. Others looked uncertain, scanning the area for bathrooms or anything familiar. Miss Thompson led them to a designated spot where they would set up their tents. "Okay, children," she said, pulling out her schedule. "Let's unpack and get our campsite ready. Then we'll gather wood for a nice campfire." She told the boys and girls to pair up and start pitching tents. Many of them had no idea how to do it, so she moved from group to group, showing them. However, the tents were older than she had realized. Some had holes and the zippers stuck. She pretended it was no big deal, saying, "We can fix it with tape. Don't worry." By the time everything was set up, the sun was dipping below the horizon. The kids sat around a small fire, roasting marshmallows and talking about the day's events. Daniel, who loved to ask questions, said, "Miss Thompson, that tire blowout was really scary. Are you sure it won't happen again?" Miss Thompson gave a shaky laugh. "It was just one of those unexpected things," she replied. "Adventures are like that sometimes. But we're safe now, and tomorrow we start our real activities." The children tried to trust her words. Some felt a sense of excitement for the next day, hoping it would be filled with fun lessons in nature. Others couldn't shake off the memory of the bus nearly losing control. Still, Miss Thompson's voice was confident, and they wanted to believe their teacher was leading them on a marvelous adventure. They went to sleep under the stars, each in their own worn-out tent. Miss Thompson lay awake a little longer, thinking about the day's troubles. She told herself it was just bad luck. She looked up at the shining moon and whispered, "Tomorrow will be better." But she couldn't stop a tiny knot of worry from growing in her stomach as the forest around them whispered in the wind. Little did she know that this was only the beginning of their journey into chaos. More challenges lay ahead, and she would soon be forced to make choices that could put her students in even greater danger, all in the name of a trip she believed would make her a star in the world of teaching. Morning arrived with a golden light shining through the trees. The children slowly emerged from their tents, rubbing sleep from their eyes. Some were cold, having found the old tents drafty during the night. Others were stiff from sleeping on hard ground. Miss Thompson greeted them with a bright smile and a plan to make the day unforgettable. "Everyone, gather around," she called out, clapping her hands to get their attention. She stood in front of a large board where she had written the day's activities. "Today, we're going to do something really special. We have sponsors from an adventure company who want us to try cliff hiking and kayaking." The children exchanged uneasy looks. A boy named Kevin raised his hand timidly. "What is cliff hiking?" he asked. Miss Thompson pointed to a tall, rocky formation not too far in the distance. "We will hike along the edges of that cliff, using ropes and helmets," she explained. "It will be thrilling." Lisa, the shy girl, asked in a small voice, "Is it safe for us?" "We're just kids." Miss Thompson waved away her concerns. "You'll have adult supervision," she said. "You'll wear the right equipment. This is a chance to learn about being brave and adventurous." Deep down, Miss Thompson knew these activities were considered extreme, especially for students who had never done anything like this before. But she also knew that the sponsor had given her extra funding and promised special photos she could use to show how innovative her teaching methods were. This was her chance to stand out, to prove she wasn't just a normal teacher. She turned to the group and declared, "This is a lesson in courage, everyone. We won't back down from a little challenge, will we?" Some of the children felt a thrill of excitement. Others, like Lisa and Kevin, felt knots in their stomachs. Still, they looked up to Miss Thompson and didn't want to disappoint her. They nodded slowly, trusting that the teacher had their best interests at heart. They set off towards the rocky cliff, following Miss Thompson and a guide from the adventure company. The guide looked confident and carried ropes and harnesses. He explained how to wear the gear and how to keep balance on the narrow path. "Okay, kids," the guide said. "Step where I step, and make sure your harness is snug." He began to lead the first group around the cliff's edge. The wind was stronger up there, and the children clung to the rock wall. Each gust made them tremble. Miss Thompson watched from a short distance, snapping pictures with her phone. She called out words of encouragement. "You're doing great. Keep going." Inside, she felt uneasy. The path seemed steeper than she had imagined. She worried that one slip could send someone tumbling down the rocky slope. But she pushed away the thought. After all, she had already told them it was fine. Suddenly, Sarah, a small girl with braids, froze in place. She gripped the rope tightly, tears in her eyes. "I'm scared," she squeaked, unable to move forward or back. The rest of the group halted, unsure what to do. Miss Thompson hurried over, trying to sound calm. "Sarah, don't worry," she said. "You can do this. Look at the guide. Follow his steps." Sarah shook her head. I want to go back, she cried. But Miss Thompson didn't want to disrupt the schedule. She felt irritated that Sarah's fear might slow everyone down. She crouched beside the girl and whispered, "Sarah, remember this trip is about being brave. If you give up now, you'll miss the chance to grow. Let's just keep going, okay?" Trembling, Sarah took a shaky breath and stepped forward. The guide helped her move 1 foot at a time. Eventually, the group finished the cliff section, hearts pounding. Miss Thompson took more photos, praising them. "You see? That was amazing! You've conquered the cliff." The students were relieved to be on flat ground again, but many felt exhausted. Lisa whispered to Kevin, "I was so scared. I almost couldn't breathe." Kevin nodded in agreement, wishing they could just play normal games instead. Next, Miss Thompson led them to a nearby river where kayaks were lined up on the shore. The water rushed by, not too deep, but swift enough to make the children nervous. The adventure company guide told them how to hold the paddle and steer, but it was all new and confusing. One by one, the kids climbed into the kayaks, some of them wobbling and nearly tipping over. Miss Thompson cheered from the shore, calling out, "Remember, this is fun. You're learning to be bold, just like explorers." The kids tried to paddle in groups, but the current pulled them faster than expected. A few panicked, bumping into rocks or each other. The guide did his best to keep them steady, but it was obvious that they were out of their comfort zone. Miss Thompson stood there, phone in hand, taking pictures for her sponsor. She wanted to capture the thrill, the challenge, the wow factor that would impress everyone when she returned. In her mind, this was exactly the kind of bold teaching that would win her that special award. She saw the children's fearful faces, but told herself they would thank her later when they felt proud and strong. After about an hour, the kayaking session ended. Some kids were soaked, shivering, and even in tears. Miss Thompson hurried them back to the campsite to dry off and rest. She said, "Look how brave you've been. Today, you faced fears and won." But not everyone felt victorious. That night, by the campfire, the group sat quietly, nibbling on their dinners. Timmy rubbed a bruise on his arm from bumping into a rock. Lisa stared at the flames, remembering how she almost flipped over in her kayak. Sarah kept replaying the scary moment on the cliff, wondering if she'd ever feel safe again. Miss Thompson, however, seemed pleased. She told them, "Your parents will be so proud of you. And guess what? Tomorrow we'll do another rock climbing session. It'll be just as exciting." A boy named Oliver blurted out, "But I don't think we should do more scary stuff, Miss Thompson. Why can't we just have normal camp activities?" Miss Thompson's face hardened. She didn't like hearing doubts. "Oliver," she said firmly, "this is not your average trip. We're here to learn real lessons about courage and adventure. If we do easy things, we won't learn as much." The children glanced at one another. They felt unsure. Should they speak up about their fears, or should they stay quiet and trust Miss Thompson? In the end, most stayed silent, hoping that she, as their teacher, knew best. Later, as they crawled into their tents, they whispered among themselves. Some said they didn't want to do more extreme activities, but they felt like they had no choice. Miss Thompson had a strong hold on them. She had a way of making them feel guilty for being scared or wanting to back out. Little by little, a sense of unease spread through the group. They were in the middle of nowhere with no easy way to leave. Miss Thompson seemed determined to push them to their limits, and the kids felt trapped by her words about bravery and learning. Still, no one could guess just how dangerous the next day's climbing session would become, or how quickly Miss Thompson's dreams of a bold teaching adventure would twist into a real-life nightmare. For now, they tried to sleep, huddling close to stay warm, unaware that the worst was yet to come. The next morning, the sun rose over the campsite, painting the sky with soft pinks and oranges. The children stretched and yawned. Some woke up excited, ready for another day outdoors. Others felt a knot of dread in their stomachs, remembering the previous day's frightening experiences. Miss Thompson wasted no time gathering everyone around. Her eyes shone with determination, like she was on a mission. "Today we're going rock climbing," she announced. Don't worry, we have ropes, helmets, and everything we need to stay safe. In reality, the climbing gear was old. The ropes were somewhat worn, but Miss Thompson chose to trust the sponsor's assurance that it was still good. The sponsor had also provided a young assistant named Alan who claimed to know about climbing. But he was only a trainee with limited experience leading large groups of kids. They hiked to a towering rock face near the edge of the forest. It looked tall and imposing against the morning sky. The children gazed up at it with wide eyes. Some hearts pounded with both excitement and fear. Alan showed them how to put on the harnesses, tie knots, and grip the rocks. If you listen carefully and follow instructions, he said, you'll be fine. He set up a couple of climbing routes with anchors and ropes. Miss Thompson clapped her hands. All right, let's begin, she said, ushering the first few kids forward. Remember, adversity builds character. A few children climbed up slowly, one step at a time, with Alan guiding them from below. At first, it seemed to be going okay. The kids carefully found footholds, used their hands to grip the rock, and inched upward. But then everything changed in an instant. A boy named Adam, who was determined to prove he was brave, tried climbing a steeper section by himself. He didn't notice that his rope was not secure in the anchor. He placed his foot on a loose rock and it gave way. He slipped. Adam, a girl screamed. The entire group froze as Adam fell a few feet before the rope caught him. But the jerk was harsh and something in the old rope system snapped. Adam slammed into the wall, landing on a small ledge. He cried out in pain, clutching his arm. Tears streamed down his cheeks. The kids gasped, some of them bursting into tears. Miss Thompson and Alan rushed forward. Adam's arm was twisted at a strange angle, and it was clear he was badly hurt. Alan climbed carefully to reach Adam, trying to help him down. Miss Thompson covered her mouth with trembling hands. She was not prepared for this. Panic twisted in her stomach, but she forced a steady expression for the sake of the other students. Alan managed to lower Adam to the ground. The boy's face was pale, and he whimpered in agony. Some of the other kids stood around, shocked by the sight of his injury. Miss Thompson kneeled beside Adam, trying to calm him. It's going to be all right, she said, though her voice shook. Her hands fumbled through the first aid kit, which was incomplete. She did her best to support the fractured arm, but she clearly wasn't trained for serious accidents like this. One student whispered, "Should we call an ambulance?" Another said, "Where's the hospital?" Their voices were shaky and scared. Miss Thompson pressed her lips into a thin line. They were far from any hospital. The closest town was at least an hour away by bus, if the bus could even navigate those rough roads quickly. She looked at Alan, who shrugged helplessly. "We can try to drive him to a clinic," Miss Thompson said, but she thought about how this would derail her schedule. Then she thought about the parents finding out. Would they blame her? Would this ruin her chances at the award? She forced a reassuring smile and turned to the group. "Adam will be fine," she said in a bright voice. "We'll get him back to camp and see what we can do. This is just a small setback." Adam whimpered. It hurt so much, tears rolling down his cheeks. His arm hung limp, clearly broken. Miss Thompson avoided looking directly at it, feeling nauseous. But she also felt pressure not to appear weak in front of the students. She told the others, accidents happen. Adversity builds character, remember? Let's help Adam walk back, and then the rest of you can continue your activities. We can't let one mishap stop us from making the most of this trip. Some children couldn't believe what they were hearing. Adam was badly hurt, and Miss Thompson wanted to continue the rock climbing. "Sarah," trembling, asked Miss Thompson, "Can we stop now?" "I'm scared." Miss Thompson's eyes hardened. "No, Sarah," she snapped. Then she softened her tone. "This trip is meant to teach you strength and courage. Adam's injury is unfortunate, but we must go on. Life doesn't stop for every obstacle." The guide, Alan, looked uncomfortable. He said quietly, "Maybe we should end the session for today. The kids are clearly upset." Miss Thompson glared at him. She needed the sponsor's support, and if they reported back that she had canceled the activity, it might look bad. "We'll see," she murmured. "First, let's handle Adam." A couple of older students helped Adam walk, cradling his injured arm. Each step made him wince and cry out. The rest of the group followed slowly, shaken by what they had seen. Back at the campsite, Miss Thompson grabbed her phone. She had very little signal, but she tried calling the nearest clinic. She managed to speak to someone who told her that Adam would need x-rays and possibly a cast, but they couldn't send an ambulance so far out. He would have to be brought in. Miss Thompson looked at Adam, who was lying on a makeshift bed with tears streaming down his face. She glanced at the road that led out of the campsite. Remembering how dangerous it was, she hesitated. "We can drive him ourselves later," she said, trying to comfort Adam. "Right now, let's just ice your arm with the cold packs we have, okay?" She assured herself that it was just a fracture. People get fractures all the time, right? It would be okay. The other students sat around, feeling helpless. Some cried, others stared at the ground. They couldn't understand why Miss Thompson wasn't rushing Adam to a hospital. But Miss Thompson was too caught up in keeping her schedule intact. She told herself that they would drive him in a few hours after she had time to calm everyone down and think of a plan that wouldn't ruin the entire trip. As the day wore on, the students grew uneasy. They could hear Adam whimpering in pain now and then. They felt guilty for wanting to do other activities while their friend was hurt. But Miss Thompson insisted, "Go ahead, have some lunch and rest. We're still on track. We'll handle Adam's situation properly soon." This was the first catastrophe, and it had shaken everyone to the core. The children saw that Miss Thompson's words about adversity building character felt cold and hollow when someone was truly hurt. Yet they were stuck in a remote campsite with no one else to turn to. As evening fell, Adam's arm still throbbed with pain. Miss Thompson finally arranged to take the bus to the clinic, but it was dark and the roads would be even more treacherous. Before leaving, she told the rest of the group, "Stay here. I'll be back soon. Keep following the schedule." The fact that she left a bunch of shaken children in a campsite with minimal adult supervision showed just how far her priorities had shifted. She was more concerned with appearances and continuing the trip than with truly caring for her students' well-being. In the gathering darkness, the children huddled around the campfire, silent and worried. They thought about Adam, about how he had screamed when he fell. They thought about the scary roads and whether Miss Thompson could even get him to help in time. They felt a deep chill, not just from the cool night air, but from the realization that maybe their teacher's ambitions were more important to her than their safety. Little did they know, this injury was only a taste of the disaster that was yet to come. Nature had her own plans, and soon, a storm would arrive that would change everything forever. The night after Adam's accident was eerily quiet. The children stayed in their tents, tossing and turning, haunted by the memory of Adam's fall. Miss Thompson finally returned in the middle of the night, looking exhausted. She announced that Adam was in the clinic and would be fine, though his arm would likely need a cast. She spoke about it like it was no big deal. Dawn broke gray and heavy. Dark clouds gathered over the distant mountains and a cold wind whipped through the campsite. Some of the kids stood by the river, staring at the angry sky. Kevin muttered, "It looks like a storm is coming." Sure enough, by lunchtime, the sky opened up. Rain pounded down, and the wind howled through the trees. Tents shook violently, and water pooled on the ground. Miss Thompson hurried around, shouting, "Everyone, zip up your tents. Keep everything inside and dry." But the rain was relentless. Soon, the campsite was soaked. Streams of water formed trenches around the tents. Some sleeping bags were drenched, and supplies got wet. The children huddled under a flimsy shelter, their teeth chattering as the temperature dropped. Around evening, the storm grew even worse, with lightning flashes and thunder that made the ground tremble. The river, once calm, began to swell. The roaring water turned muddy brown, and the level rose inch by inch. Frightened, the children asked Miss Thompson if they should leave, but she shook her head. "We're going to ride this out. We can't travel in this storm," she declared. She told them to stay put, but inside she was panicking. She had never dealt with a storm like this in a remote location. She had no real emergency training, and her phone signal kept dropping. Wind lashed the trees, and some branches snapped, crashing around the campsite. The children screamed and ran from tent to tent, trying to find a safer spot. The soft dirt turned into slippery mud. People stumbled and fell, coating themselves with muck. Lisa clung to Sarah, tears in her eyes. "I'm so scared," she whispered. Sarah was too frightened to speak. They both shivered in their damp jackets, wishing they could go home. Timmy tugged at Miss Thompson's sleeve. "Please, can't we leave?" he cried. "We can't stay here all night like this." Miss Thompson pressed a shaky smile on her face. "It'll pass," she insisted, though she could barely hear herself above the roaring wind. "Everything is going to be fine." Deep down, she knew they were in serious trouble. Suddenly, a loud crack tore through the air. The children shrieked as a large tree near the campsite fell, smashing down with a thunderous crash. Mud splashed everywhere, and the vibrations shook the ground. Luckily, no one was hurt, but the children were terrified. That's when small rocks began to tumble down the hillside behind the campsite. The soil, loosened by the heavy rain, couldn't hold together. The kids watched in horror as patches of the hill slid down, forming miniature landslides. One muddy flow nearly reached the tents. Miss Thompson realized the situation was much worse than she'd expected. They were on unstable ground. If a large landslide occurred, it could bury them all. She called out, "Stay in your tents. Don't move." But the children were frantic. Rain poured through leaks in the old tent fabric, soaking their clothes and belongings. The wind threatened to yank the tents from their stakes. Some kids cried out for their parents. Others just curled up, shaking, trying to shut out the howling storm. Moments later, Miss Thompson felt her phone buzz. She had a text from the bus driver, Mr. Collier, who was sheltering in the bus parked a short distance away. It read, "Road is flooding. Might not be able to leave if this keeps up." Her heart pounded. If they couldn't leave, they were trapped. The main road, already precarious, could be washed out by the rising floodwaters. She tried calling for help, but the signal was too weak. She only got bits of static on the other end. All through the night, the storm raged. Lightning lit up the campsite like a strobe light, revealing terrified faces peeking from behind tent flaps. Thunder shook the very ground beneath them. Rain pelted down so hard it felt like tiny needles on their skin. Miss Thompson tried to rally the children. "Stay calm," she shouted over the wind. She guided them to a slightly higher spot near a cluster of thick trees. "We'll be safer here," she said. But the children weren't convinced. They could see the water rising, forming puddles that merged into small streams. Sarah slipped in the mud, scraping her knee. Lisa tried to help her, but she nearly fell too. Their clothes were soaked, and their bodies shook from the cold. Miss Thompson tried to find some tarps to create a makeshift shelter, but the wind kept ripping them out of her hands. At one point, Mr. Collier rushed over from the bus, shouting, "We can't drive out of here. The road is blocked by rocks and flooding. We need to wait until it's clear." Miss Thompson just stared, feeling trapped. She wished she had never come here, but it was too late to go back. That night seemed to stretch on forever. Water seeped into sleeping bags. Food got wet and soggy. Some of the kids coughed and shivered, their lips turning blue with cold. They huddled together, trying to stay warm, trying to keep each other calm. Miss Thompson felt a wave of guilt wash over her. She realized she was in over her head. She had wanted this trip to be a grand adventure, but she never truly prepared for the dangers of nature. She thought about the warnings from her colleagues, the concerns of the parents, and how she had shrugged them all off. Now, here they were, trapped in a relentless storm, facing landslides and floods. She wanted to scream at herself for being so reckless. But she couldn't show weakness in front of the students. She tried to stand tall and force a smile whenever they looked at her with pleading eyes. As the storm roared on, Miss Thompson prayed it would end soon. Each time the thunder boomed, she winced, imagining the headlines if something terrible happened. She also feared the shame of being exposed for her poor planning. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, dawn came, and the rain slowed to a drizzle. The campsite was a muddy wreck with battered tents and scattered equipment. Water still rushed through newly formed channels, and fallen trees lay in tangled heaps. The children emerged, exhausted and soaked to the bone. Some coughed and sniffled, feeling sick. They looked around at the damage, their eyes filled with despair. Miss Thompson tried to give a reassuring speech, but her words rang hollow in the soggy morning air. They had survived the night, but at a high cost. Many kids were frightened, cold, and hungry. The campsite was barely functional, and the road might be impassable. They thought things couldn't get any worse, but the storm had only set the stage for even darker events. Because in the aftermath of a storm like that, the danger doesn't simply vanish. Mudslides can still happen, roads can crumble, and fear can grow. And fear is exactly what crept through the group, especially when a desperate child decided to call for help behind Miss Thompson's back, setting a new and dangerous chain of events in motion. The morning after the terrible storm, the campsite looked like a battlefield. Mud covered everything, and the air was cold and damp. Children wandered around, trying to salvage their belongings. Some were crying, others too tired to speak. Miss Thompson wiped sweat from her brow, even though the air was chilly. She felt overwhelmed. Everything was out of control, and she didn't know how to fix it. She walked from tent to tent, trying to cheer the kids up with a forced smile. But they could see through her act. Suddenly, a parent's voice crackled through the silence. "Hello? Is anyone there?" It was coming from a child's phone. One boy, named Gabriel, had managed to get a signal on his phone and called his mother. He spoke in hushed, frightened tones, telling her about the storm and the landslides. Miss Thompson, hearing this, rushed over. "Gabriel, what are you doing?" she demanded, her eyes wide with alarm. She snatched the phone out of his hand before he could say more. Gabriel trembled. "I'm sorry, Miss Thompson," he stammered. "I was just scared. I wanted my mom to know we're not okay here." Miss Thompson's face hardened. She worried that if parents found out how bad the situation was, they would blame her. Worse yet, the media might get involved, and her whole reputation could be destroyed. "Gabriel, you should have asked me first," she scolded. "We have everything under control." But deep inside, she knew that wasn't true. They didn't have enough supplies, some kids were feeling sick, and the roads might be blocked. She was desperate to keep a lid on the truth. Yet the damage was done. Gabriel's mother now knew they were in real danger. She promised to call the police and other parents to arrange a rescue. Word spread quickly. Phones buzzed and beeped as more kids tried to reach their families, some in secret, others openly because they didn't trust Miss Thompson anymore. Meanwhile, Miss Thompson put on a brave face for the students who stood around. "Rescue is on the way," she lied. "The authorities are fully aware of our situation. They said they'll be here soon." Some kids were relieved to hear this, but others noticed that Miss Thompson refused to show them her phone or give them details. They suspected she was hiding something. In truth, Miss Thompson had barely managed to get a call through, and the authorities she spoke to said they might take a while to reach them due to the landslides and flooding. That afternoon, the students gathered under a large tree, trying to stay dry from the lingering rain. Miss Thompson stood before them, announcing that they should remain calm. "Help is on the way," she repeated. "Everything is going to be fine." However, after hours passed with no sight of rescue, the students began to question her. Timmy asked, "If help is coming, why don't we hear helicopters or sea trucks?" Sarah added, "Why haven't our parents called us back?" Miss Thompson's smile grew strained. "They're probably just delayed," she said. "We need to wait." But the children saw the worry in her eyes. Word spread that she had confiscated Gabriel's phone. Some of them muttered that they wanted to call their parents too, but Miss Thompson had insisted they conserve battery and not cause more confusion. He stormed, the mud, and the fear gripping the camp. She told him Miss Thompson might not be telling the truth about rescue efforts. Her father assured her, "Don't worry, sweetie. We're going to send help right away." Meanwhile, Miss Thompson noticed Ava was missing from the group and went searching for her. She spotted the girl behind the bushes, phone pressed to her ear. Miss Thompson's heart pounded with anger and fear. She grabbed the phone, shouting, "What do you think you're doing?" Ava cringed. "I am sorry," she stuttered. "I just wanted my dad to know what's really happening." Furious, Miss Thompson ended the call. She was losing control. The children were taking matters into their own hands, and she felt betrayed. But a small voice in her head whispered that she was the one who had betrayed them by not keeping them safe in the first place. While Miss Thompson tried to maintain authority, the reality was that the children had lost faith in her. They whispered among themselves, calling her a liar. They felt she was more concerned with covering up her mistakes than protecting them. That night, the group huddled around a weak campfire. Miss Thompson repeated her story. "Rescue teams are on their way. I talked to them myself." But her voice was shaky and her eyes darted nervously. Kevin, who was usually quiet, spoke up. "I heard Gabriel's mom say that the rescue teams didn't know we were in such bad shape," he said softly. "Why are you lying to us?" Miss Thompson's jaw clenched. She glared at Kevin. "I'm not lying. I know what I heard. Just trust me." But the kids shook their heads. They could sense the truth behind her denial. They felt alone and scared, unsure if they would make it home safely. The trust that once bound them to Miss Thompson was shattered. In the distance, thunder rumbled again, and the sky grew darker. Some kids whimpered, frightened that another storm was on the way. Miss Thompson stared at the horizon, her heart pounding. She had no real plan if more severe weather struck. Somewhere out there, parents were making phone calls to the police, to the school, to anyone who could help. They wanted their children back, safe and sound. They demanded answers. Soon, news stations caught wind of a group of students trapped in a remote campsite, possibly with little food and no safe way out. Questions swirled about the teacher who had brought them there. Back in the camp, the atmosphere was tense. Children confronted Miss Thompson, asking for real answers. She insisted, "We can't move from here. The roads are blocked. We must stay put until help arrives." Yet it was clear she had little control. The group started dividing into smaller clusters. Some kids tried to comfort each other, while others sobbed quietly, wishing they had never come on this trip. As night fell again, Miss Thompson huddled by herself, staring at her useless phone, praying for a miracle. She felt a deep swirl of shame and anger. Anger at the kids for making calls behind her back, anger at the storm for ruining her plans, and anger at herself for not listening to the warnings. She knew that once rescue did come, she would be blamed for everything. She tried to figure out how to spin the story so she wouldn't look so guilty. But no matter how she twisted it, the truth was obvious. She had led her students into danger, ignored the signs, and now was lying to them about help. The children had turned against her, and it was only a matter of time before everyone found out just how badly she had failed. Little did they realize, the biggest test was still to come, one that would force Miss Thompson to face the consequences of her negligence in a way she never imagined. Another day dawned with gloomy skies and a haze of damp air hanging over the broken campsite. The children were exhausted, hungry, and dirty. Many had run out of clean clothes, and some were coughing from spending so many cold nights in wet tents. Miss Thompson paced around the muddy ground, trying to keep her composure. She had heard nothing further from any rescue team. With the phone signal still weak, she could only hope help would arrive soon. Her mind spun with worry. How would she explain all of this to the parents, the school board, and the media? That morning, a series of small landslides cut off the path leading back to the main road. Mr. Collier checked the area with a flashlight and shook his head grimly. "We can't drive the bus through this," he said. "We need heavy equipment to clear the debris. And the rain could start again any moment." Miss Thompson swallowed hard. The children, overhearing Mr. Collier, began to panic. "So we're stuck?" Timmy asked, his eyes brimming with tears. "Does that mean no one can get in or out?" Miss Thompson forced a wavering smile. "Don't worry. Rescue crews have tools to clear paths. They'll be here soon." But even she didn't believe her own words anymore. Shortly after, a bigger slide occurred on the opposite side of the campsite. Mud and rocks came tumbling down the slope, cutting them off from the flatter area where some of their supplies were stored. Shouts and screams filled the air as the children ran to higher ground. In the chaos, a girl named Emily, who had asthma, lost her inhaler. She tried to breathe slowly, but the stress and cold air made her chest tighten. Lisa and Sarah found Emily gasping, clutching her chest. "Help!" Lisa screamed, waving her arms. Miss Thompson arrived, eyes wide with fear. She rummaged through the scattered supplies, searching for the spare inhaler she was supposed to have packed, but it was nowhere to be found. In a trembling voice, she admitted, "I don't have another one. I forgot to bring extra medication." Emily's breathing grew worse. She wheezed, her face turning pale. The children stared at their teacher, disbelief and anger filling their eyes. How could she have forgotten such an important item? Desperate, Miss Thompson begged Mr. Collier to look through the bus, but the inhaler wasn't there either. Time felt like it was racing against them. Emily's breaths were shallow, and her lips began to turn blue. Lisa sobbed, "We have to get her to a doctor. She can't breathe." But the roads were blocked, and there was no easy way out. Miss Thompson hung her head, tears mixing with the mud on her cheeks. For the first time, she realized the full weight of her failures. She had brought them here without proper supplies, without a real plan for emergencies. And now, a student's life was in danger. She cradled Emily in her arms, whispering, "I'm so sorry." Her eyes scanned the campsite, looking for anything that might help. She felt utterly powerless. All her big talk about bravery and innovative teaching meant nothing now. Moments later, they heard the unmistakable roar of a helicopter in the distance. The children looked up, hope shining in their tearful eyes. A rescue helicopter was circling, searching for a safe place to land. A team of rescuers, alerted by frantic parents, had finally arrived. The helicopter found a spot a little away from the muddy campsite, and a group of rescuers jumped out, rushing toward them. They carried medical kits and radio equipment. Miss Thompson waved her arms, screaming, "Over here. We need help." Within minutes, the rescuers reached them. They gave Emily oxygen from a special tank and used a portable nebulizer to help her breathe. Slowly, her chest loosened and color returned to her face. The children cried tears of relief, hugging each other. They couldn't believe they were finally being saved. As the rescue team worked to secure the area, more vehicles and officials arrived, battling through the messy road. Parents who could join the effort came running, calling out their children's names. The campsite was flooded with voices and flashing lights. Miss Thompson stood off to the side, feeling numb. She watched as paramedics checked each student, making sure they were okay. She could see the looks on the parents' faces: shock, anger, relief. Some parents held their sobbing children close, glaring at Miss Thompson as if she were a monster. News reporters appeared, cameras rolling. They interviewed the rescuers and asked the students what had happened. One brave child, Ava, spoke through tears, explaining how Miss Thompson kept pushing them into dangerous activities. Another child, Kevin, admitted they were terrified and felt Miss Thompson hadn't listened to their concerns. Miss Thompson tried to give her side of the story, babbling about how everything was meant for the children's growth and that the storm was unexpected. But her words fell on deaf ears. The reporters captured each shaky answer, painting a picture of a reckless teacher who endangered her students for some grand, selfish plan. Soon, an investigator from the local authorities arrived. He questioned Miss Thompson about her qualifications, her safety measures, and the decisions she made during the trip. She stammered, struggling to defend herself. She knew she looked guilty. She felt the weight of everyone's accusing eyes. Parents confronted her, yelling, "How could you put our children in danger like this? And you lied to them. You told them help was coming when you hadn't even called." Miss Thompson tried to explain, tried to apologize, but their anger was overpowering. She saw Adam, the boy who broke his arm, being wheeled on a stretcher to an ambulance. His mother glared at Miss Thompson, tears streaming down her face. She said nothing, but the look in her eyes was more painful than any words could be. With Emily stable and the rest of the children safe, the rescue operation moved quickly. Buses came to take the children back to town. Medics made sure everyone was okay, and social workers took statements from the shaken students. Miss Thompson stood alone amid the chaos, her career and reputation crumbling before her eyes. The children she had once inspired now feared and resented her. Parents who had trusted her now wanted her punished. The media was already calling her the reckless teacher who caused a near tragedy. As she was led away by officials to answer more questions, Miss Thompson thought about her dream of winning the Innovative Teaching Award. Now, it was clear she would never hold that trophy. Instead, she faced public shame and possibly legal consequences. She realized, with a sinking feeling, that her choices had hurt the very children she was supposed to protect. In that moment, she wished she had listened to the warning signs, to her colleagues, to the worried parents. She wished she had put safety before ambition. But it was too late. The final reckoning had come, and there was no escape from the truth of what she had done. In the days that followed, the children were reunited with their families. They returned to their homes, grateful to be safe but traumatized by the experience. Many had nightmares about the storm, the landslides, and the moments when they thought they wouldn't survive. The media covered the story extensively, labeling it the school trip disaster. Parents gave interviews, sharing how they felt betrayed by a teacher they had once trusted. Some cried on camera, thanking the rescuers for saving their children. Others demanded justice, insisting Miss Thompson be held responsible for every injury and emotional scar. At the hospital, Adam's arm was set in a cast. The doctor said he would need time to heal, and his parents hinted they might take legal action against Miss Thompson for endangering him. Emily was also recovering, resting at home with her parents, making sure she had her asthma medication at all times. Meanwhile, the school board launched an official investigation. They pored over the documents Miss Thompson had submitted. They discovered how she had exaggerated her outdoor qualifications, chosen cheaper but unsafe options, and manipulated the paperwork. They were shocked by her recklessness. News outlets replayed clips of interviews with students who described Miss Thompson's obsession with pushing them to do extreme activities. They also highlighted how she had lied about rescue efforts, further endangering the group. Public opinion quickly turned against her. Miss Thompson found herself summoned to a hearing with the school board and local authorities. She walked in, head bowed, surrounded by angry parents. Mr. Adams, the principal, tried to maintain order as tensions ran high. Some parents shouted at Miss Thompson, calling her names and demanding she answer for her actions. Through trembling lips, Miss Thompson tried to explain. "I wanted the children to have a real adventure," she said softly. "I thought it would teach them important lessons. I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt." The storm was worse than anyone expected. But the parents were not moved. One mother stood up, holding her child's hand. "How dare you risk our children's lives for your own ambition?" she yelled. "My son still wakes up crying in the middle of the night." The father of another student added, "You lied to them. You called them fearmongers when they had genuine concerns. You pushed them into dangerous activities. This was about you, not them." Miss Thompson's eyes brimmed with tears. She wanted to defend herself, to say she did care about the students. But deep down, she knew they were right. She had let her own pride and lust for recognition blind her to the dangers. She had put her students at risk and then tried to cover it up. The school board voted unanimously to terminate Miss Thompson's employment. She was effectively fired on the spot. They made it clear she would never teach at that school again, and likely no other school would hire her after the scandal. On top of that, the authorities informed her that she could face criminal charges for negligence and endangering minors. Investigations were ongoing, and she would probably be called to court. Miss Thompson sat quietly, feeling numb, as flashes from reporters' cameras lit up the room. Outside, a crowd of upset parents and curious onlookers surrounded her. Some hurled insults, others demanded she pay for the children's medical bills. She tried to slip away unnoticed, but the cameras followed. She felt like she was drowning in shame and regret. In the weeks that followed, the story continued to dominate the news. Details emerged about how Miss Thompson had cut corners with the bus driver, the camping gear, and the sponsor's extreme activities. Experts spoke on TV, saying, "No teacher should ever plan such a trip without proper training and safety measures." This was a case of gross negligence. Despite all this, Miss Thompson still hoped she could somehow defend herself. She tried to post a statement online, claiming that her heart had been in the right place, that she simply wanted to give her students a memorable experience. The public responded with outrage, leaving harsh comments and calling her selfish, dangerous, and worse. Meanwhile, the children slowly returned to their usual routines, but the memory of the trip haunted them. Some needed therapy to cope with the trauma. The school board issued new rules for future trips, requiring thorough checks, experienced leaders, and safer destinations. In a strange way, Miss Thompson's failure prompted much-needed change in the system. On a bright afternoon, Adam sat with his cast in the school courtyard, talking to friends about how they were all processing the event. They whispered about how Miss Thompson had once seemed so kind and full of ideas, yet had led them into a nightmare. Some felt sorry for her, others felt only anger. Gabriel, the boy who first called his mom, said, "I guess we saved ourselves by calling our parents. Otherwise, who knows what would have happened. We couldn't rely on Miss Thompson." The others nodded in agreement. The trust they once had in their teacher was gone. Now they understood that being a good teacher is not about taking big risks for show, but about caring for your students' well-being above all else. As for Miss Thompson, she found herself in a tiny apartment, jobless and alone. She turned on the TV to see another news story about the investigation into the trip. Her face flashed on screen, and she quickly changed the channel, tears sliding down her cheeks. She knew she deserved the blame, but it still hurt to see her dreams shattered and her name dragged through the mud. She heard a knock at the door. It was a neighbor, offering a kind word or a meal. But Miss Thompson declined, choosing to remain isolated. She felt too ashamed to face anyone. She spent her days trying to figure out what to do next. Her career as a teacher was likely over, and a criminal case loomed. She had no idea how to pick up the pieces of her life. Little did she know, one last blow awaited her, a personal lawsuit from one of the families that would strip her of whatever little she had left. Only then would she truly understand that the greatest lesson from all of this was the importance of responsibility, honesty, and putting students' needs before personal ambition. In the months that followed the disastrous trip, Miss Elena Thompson's life went from bad to worse. Jobless and under investigation, she could barely leave her home without facing the scorn of the community. Newspapers ran stories like "Teacher's Fatal Obsession," "A School Trip Gone Wrong," and television programs debated how she had manipulated her students for her own gain. Even simple tasks like grocery shopping became an ordeal. People whispered and pointed at her in the aisles. Some hurled insults like "child endangerer." She started wearing a hooded jacket, hoping not to be recognized, but her face had been all over the news. There was no hiding from what she had done. One afternoon, an official letter arrived at her doorstep. It was from a legal firm representing one of the injured students, Adam, the boy who had broken his arm. His family was suing Miss Thompson personally for negligence. The letter stated that due to her reckless decisions, Adam had suffered serious harm, both physical and emotional. The lawsuit demanded a large sum in damages. Miss Thompson's hands shook as she read the letter. She slumped onto her couch, staring at the words. She felt as though her world was caving in on her. She was already in debt from the legal fees she had been paying to defend herself in the criminal investigation. Now, a civil lawsuit threatened to take what little she had left. Over the next few weeks, Miss Thompson had to meet with lawyers and attend legal hearings. She discovered that Adam's family was not the only one considering a lawsuit. A few other parents were also exploring legal options. But Adam's case moved forward first and fastest. The court date arrived on a rainy morning. Miss Thompson entered the courthouse wearing a plain suit, her hair pulled back. She saw Adam's parents, who gave her a cold, steely look. Adam himself sat quietly in the back of the courtroom, his arm still in a cast, which reminded everyone of how badly he was injured. During the trial, the lawyers painted a grim picture of her choices. They showed emails, receipts for subpar equipment, and testimonies from the children. Each piece of evidence felt like another blow to Miss Thompson's already shattered pride. She could see the jury's faces turn stony as they listened to how she had pressured the kids into dangerous activities for the sake of an award. Her own lawyer tried to argue that the storm was unpredictable and that she had done her best under the circumstances. But the prosecution countered with evidence that she had ignored warnings and continued risky activities even after accidents occurred. In the end, the jury found her personally liable for Adam's injuries. The judge ordered her to pay a substantial amount to cover medical bills, therapy, and emotional distress. The sum was far more than she could ever afford. As she left the courthouse, reporters crowded around, shoving microphones in her face. "Miss Thompson, how do you feel about the verdict?" one asked. "Do you have anything to say to Adam and his family?" She kept her head down, tears burning in her eyes, and pushed past them. That evening, she sat in her tiny apartment, staring at the wall. She realized she might have to declare bankruptcy. She could lose her car, her savings, and even the small apartment. Her teaching license was already in jeopardy, and now her finances were ruined as well. In a last, desperate attempt to find some emotional relief, she searched online for the results of the Innovative Teaching Award she had once coveted. She discovered that another teacher, who had led a successful local community gardening project, had won. Miss Thompson's name wasn't even on the list of finalists. Instead, her name now appeared in countless news articles as a warning of what can happen when ambition overshadows responsibility. The internet was full of comments calling her the teacher who put pride before safety. Some wrote that her story had become a cautionary tale in educational circles, with schools tightening their rules on field trips to avoid becoming the next headline. The system had learned from her mistake, introducing more training and inspections. In a twisted way, Miss Thompson's actions had sparked widespread change, exactly what she once hoped for, but not at all how she imagined. Instead of being praised as a pioneer, she was held up as the ultimate failure, a symbol of how not to do things. Days turned into weeks, and she rarely left her apartment. When her phone rang, it was usually someone telling her about another legal matter or a journalist seeking an interview. She stopped answering. She felt worn down, haunted by guilt and shame. Each time she tried to sleep, she remembered Adam's screams, the terror in the children's eyes, and Emily gasping for breath. Eventually, Miss Thompson slipped into isolation. She cut off contact with friends and spent her days hidden behind closed blinds. Whenever she saw her own reflection, she flinched. The sparkle she once had, the drive to be recognized, was gone, replaced by despair and regret. Yet, through her misery, society moved on. The story became old news as new headlines took over. But for Miss Thompson, the consequences remained. She had lost her job, her reputation, and most of her money. She carried a lifelong burden of knowing she had betrayed the trust of innocent children. In that sense, it was a form of poetic justice. She had chased after an award, only to become a negative example that would be remembered far longer than any prize would have been. Parents and teachers across the nation talked about her story as they revised safety protocols. "We don't want another Miss Thompson," they said, double-checking their trips to ensure no similar tragedy would occur. And so, Miss Thompson sat alone, the walls of her apartment seeming to close in around her. She thought about writing letters of apology to each child, but shame kept her from putting pen to paper. Every day, she replayed her choices in her mind, wishing she could go back and do things differently, listen to the warnings, respect the limits, and truly protect the children. But karma had already dealt its hand. The teacher who once dreamed of being honored now found herself living in disgrace, the memory of her failure echoing in every quiet corner of her life. Her final punishment wasn't just the legal fees or the lost job. It was the unshakable knowledge that she had hurt the very people who trusted her most. Her story became a viral cautionary tale, taught in education seminars and discussed on social media. People shook their heads at the fatal obsession that led a teacher astray. And although it led to better safety regulations and more responsible planning for school trips, Miss Thompson was left as a lonely figure in the shadows, a reminder that ambition without responsibility can destroy lives. The end.